The night Elizabeth Ashford poured tea for 26 guests, including the woman sitting in her chair, no one at the table dared lift their cup. Not because the tea was cold, because her hands were perfectly steady. Later, people would say they had seen it coming. They would claim they had noticed the signs, the way the Duke looked through his wife rather than at her, the way Lady Vivienne Harlow laughed just a little too loudly in rooms she had no business being in. They would say, over their own tea, in their own safe drawing rooms, that of course it was only a matter of time. But that night, not a single soul at that table knew what Elizabeth Ashford was going to do next. Neither did she. Elizabeth had been trained for this life, the way a soldier is trained for war, methodically, thoroughly, and with the understanding that the battlefield would show no mercy. She was the second daughter of the Earl of Pembridge, which meant she was valuable but not precious, presentable but not dazzling. Her mother had made this distinction clear early. Your sister has beauty, Elizabeth. You have something more useful, sense. It was not said unkindly. It was simply said the way one states the weather. She had learned French, Italian, and the precise art of silence. She knew which fork preceded which course, which compliment opened a closed door, and which smile communicated disagreement without the vulgarity of an actual argument. By the time she was 22, she was considered, in the quiet assessment of London society, to be exceptionally accomplished. James Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, had chosen her for exactly these reasons. He had not pretended otherwise. Their courtship, if it could be called that, had lasted 6 weeks and involved 3 afternoon calls, 1 garden walk, and a dinner at which he had observed her manage a difficult seating arrangement with such seamless efficiency that he had apparently decided, then and there, that she would do. She had known this. She had accepted his proposal anyway. Because in 1887, a woman of sense understood that a good marriage was not a fairy tale. It was a contract, and James Ashford, whatever his shortcomings, was a man of his word, at least in the beginning. He had given her Ashford House. He had given her an allowance, a staff of 31, and a small estate in the countryside called Wren Cottage that she had immediately and quietly loved with her whole heart. He had given her his name and his arm at every function that required both. He was never cruel. He was never warm either, but Elizabeth had told herself that warmth was overrated. Warmth did not pay the bills. Warmth did not secure one's position. For 4 years, the arrangement had held. Then 14 months ago, James had come home from his club in unusually high spirits, and everything had begun to change, slowly at first, then all at once, the way a crack moves through fine porcelain. He began canceling dinners at the last moment. He began arriving home at hours that required no explanation only because she had learned not to ask for one. Small things disappeared from his attention, her opinion on the summer guest list, her request to repaint the east drawing room, the anniversary of their marriage. He was not absent exactly. He was simply elsewhere, even when he was standing directly in front of her. She noticed, she said nothing. That was her first mistake, she would later think. Not the silence itself. The silence had been correct, strategic, necessary. The mistake was believing that silence was enough. That if she remained impeccable, remained useful, remained the most competent woman in every room she entered, it would be sufficient armor against whatever was coming. It was not. The morning she understood this with full clarity was an ordinary Tuesday in October. She had been in the downstairs study reviewing household accounts when James appeared in the doorway, already dressed to go out. "I've invited someone for the weekend," he said, in the tone one uses to announce a slight change in dinner plans. "Lady Vivienne Harlow. We were acquainted years ago. She's recently returned to London." Elizabeth had looked up from the ledger. "Of course, I'll have the blue guest room prepared." "The rose room," he said. "She prefers natural light." He was gone before she could respond. She sat for a moment with her pen still in her hand. Then she dipped it carefully in the ink and returned to the accounts. She did not yet know the name Vivienne Harlow. She did not yet know what that name would come to mean to James, to society, to her own life. But she remembered, very clearly, that he had known which room that woman preferred. And she had written that down, in the ledger she kept in her own mind, the one no one else would ever read. Not yet. Vivienne Harlow arrived on a Friday afternoon in a carriage that was, Elizabeth noted, slightly too fine for a woman of merely comfortable means. She was beautiful. Elizabeth had expected that. What she had not expected was the particular quality of that beauty. It was not soft, not delicate, not the kind that invited protection. It was deliberate, constructed with the same careful attention one gave to a weapon before carrying it into a room. She wore red, not a deep, safe burgundy, red, on a Friday afternoon arriving at another woman's home as a guest. Elizabeth received her in the entrance hall with a smile that had taken years to perfect, warm enough to be irreproachable, cool enough to communicate everything that mattered. "Lady Harlow, what a pleasure. I hope the journey wasn't too tiring." Vivienne looked at her, not at her face, at her. The way one looks at furniture one is considering rearranging. "Not at all," she said. "What a lovely house." She said it the way one says what a charming little dog, with a brightness that contained, at its center, absolutely nothing. James appeared behind Elizabeth then, and the temperature of the room changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The way a window opens somewhere and you feel the air shift before you can identify the source. "Vivienne." He said her name differently than he said other names. Elizabeth filed this away without expression. "James." Vivienne smiled, and for just a moment she forgot entirely that Elizabeth was standing there. Then she remembered, and the smile widened, which was somehow worse. The weekend proceeded with the precision of a very well-rehearsed performance, in which Elizabeth was the only one who had not been given the script. Vivienne was charming at dinner. She was clever, well-read, and had the particular talent of making every man in a conversation feel he had just said something uniquely intelligent. She deferred to James on everything, his opinions on politics, on art, on the estate, in a way that managed to feel like admiration rather than flattery. There was a difference, and Vivienne knew exactly where the line was. Elizabeth watched all of this from her end of the table and ate her soup, and said the correct things to the correct people, and smiled the correct smile. On Saturday morning she found them in the garden. They were not doing anything improper. They were simply standing close together near the roses, talking in low voices, and James was laughing, really laughing, the way he had perhaps laughed before Elizabeth had known him, in some version of himself she had never been permitted to meet. She watched from the window for 3 seconds, then she turned away and rang for her maid. It was later that afternoon in the drawing room that the first real blow landed. The house party had gathered after tea. Someone, Lord Pemberton, she thought, had raised the question of the new railway expansion and whether it would affect property values in the north. Elizabeth knew this subject. She knew it well. Her father had spent 2 years navigating exactly this question with his own estate, and she had sat through enough of his conversations to have formed a precise and useful opinion. She offered it, clearly, concisely, without excessive decoration. There was a brief pause. Then James said, "Vivienne, you were saying something similar at dinner last week, about the northern lines." And Vivienne had smiled and spoken, and the conversation had moved toward her like a river finding a new course, and Elizabeth's words dissolved into the air as though they had never been said at all. No one was rude, no one laughed, no one did anything that could be pointed to later as an offense. That was the art of it. Elizabeth picked up her embroidery. Her stitches were, as always, perfectly even. Vivienne stayed 3 days. When she left, she pressed Elizabeth's hand at the door and said, "You must come to my townhouse for tea. I insist." "How kind," said Elizabeth. She never intended to go, but she memorized the address anyway. That evening, James informed her that he had invited Lady Harlow to the Ashford winter dinner. The large one, the important one, the one Elizabeth had been planning since September. "Of course," said Elizabeth, "I'll add her to the seating arrangement." "She'll need a prominent seat," James said, already turning away. "She's an important connection." Elizabeth nodded once. She waited until he had left the room. Then she sat down at her writing desk, opened her notebook, and beneath Vivienne Harlow's name, which she had written there on the first evening in her neat, unhurried hand, she added 2 words. "The dinner." And she began to plan. The invitations had gone out 6 weeks prior, on Ashford House stationery, in Elizabeth's own hand. 26 guests, 4 courses, 2 footmen per table, the good silver, not the everyday silver, the good silver, the Ashford pieces that had been in the family since the previous century and came out only for occasions that warranted them. Elizabeth had planned every detail with the quiet thoroughness she applied to everything. The flowers, the placement of the candles, the temperature of the rooms, the precise order in which the wines would be introduced. She had also planned the seating arrangement 3 times. The first version she had done in September before Vivienne, the second in October after the garden, the third, the final one, the one she had handed to the butler with a steady hand and an expressionless face. She had done the night James came to her sitting room and told her, in the same tone he used to discuss drainage repairs, that Lady Harlow would be sitting at the head of the table. Elizabeth had looked at him for a moment. "The head of the table," she repeated. "She is the guest of honor," he said. "It's the appropriate placement." "I see," she paused. "And where shall I sit?" He had the grace, at least, to look briefly uncomfortable. "You'll be nearby. It's simply a matter of—" "Of course," she said. "I'll adjust the arrangement." He left. She sat for a long time at her writing desk without moving. Then she picked up her pen, drew a single clean line through the 3rd seating chart, and wrote a 4th. The guests arrived at 8. They were the kind of people who noticed everything and said very little, which was, in Elizabeth's experience, the most dangerous kind. Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Countess of Wexham, who missed nothing and forgot nothing and had been keeping mental notes on the aristocracy for 40 years. Sir Frederick Alcott and his wife, 2 members of Parliament, a bishop, and 20 others who moved in exactly the circles that mattered, in exactly the ways that mattered. Vivienne arrived last. She wore ivory, not white ivory, which was somehow more pointed, and she entered the drawing room on James's arm with the ease of a woman who had decided some time ago that she belonged wherever she chose to stand. Elizabeth greeted her at the door. "Lady Harlow, so glad you could come." Elizabeth. Vivienne had begun using her Christian name sometime in November without being invited to. "What a magnificent evening you've arranged." "Thank you," said Elizabeth. "Do come in." Dinner was announced at 9. The guests moved through to the dining room in the prescribed order, finding their places, settling into their chairs with the small rustlings and murmurs that preceded a formal meal. The candles were lit. The silver caught the light. Everything was exactly as it should be. Vivienne Harlow found her place at the head of the table. She sat down with the smoothness of someone who had been expecting this. Perhaps she had been. Perhaps James had told her. Elizabeth did not know and had decided by that point that it did not matter. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Elizabeth, standing at the sideboard where the tea service had been placed, an unusual arrangement, but she had instructed the staff precisely, lifted the teapot. She moved to the first guest on her left. She poured. She moved to the next. She moved, unhurried and utterly composed, around the full length of that table, past the parliamentary members, past the Countess of Wexham whose eyes tracked her like a hawk, past her husband who had gone very still in his chair, all the way to the foot of the table where she sat last and folded her hands in her lap. She had poured the tea herself, for all 26 guests, including the woman sitting in her chair. Her hands had not trembled once. The room was absolutely silent. It was the Countess of Wexham who recovered first. She lifted her cup, took a precise sip, and said to the gentleman beside her, "The Ashford blend. I've always found it exceptional." The table exhaled, conversation resumed, cutlery touched china, the first course was served. But something had shifted in that room, and every single person at that table felt it, even if not one of them could have said precisely what had changed. James did not look at Elizabeth for the rest of the meal. Vivienne smiled too much. And Elizabeth ate her dinner and spoke pleasantly to her neighbors, and at no point during the next 3 hours did her expression betray a single thing she was thinking. It was only later, much later, after the guests had gone and the staff had cleared, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, that she allowed herself to sit alone in the dark of her sitting room. She had not won anything tonight, she knew that. The chair at the head of the table was still Vivienne's chair in every way that currently mattered. James was still James. The situation was still the situation. But 26 people had watched her pour that tea. And 26 people would remember it. She had not cried. She had not raged. She had not committed a single act that anyone could call unseemly. She had simply been, with perfect clarity, exactly who she was in a room full of people who had been waiting to see her crumble. She reached for the notebook on her desk, opened it to Vivienne Harlow's page. Beneath the dinner she wrote 2 more words. They saw. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed and slept without difficulty for the first time in months. Margaret Ashford, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, was 71 years old and had outlived 2 kings, 1 husband, and the patience of everyone who had ever underestimated her. She was small, sharp-boned, and dressed always in gray, not the soft, apologetic gray of half-mourning, but a hard, deliberate gray that suggested she had made her peace with the world and found the world somewhat lacking. She kept a house in Mayfair that smelled of beeswax and old paper, received visitors on Tuesday afternoons only, and had opinions about everything that she expressed with the serene confidence of someone who had stopped caring decades ago what anyone thought of them. Elizabeth had always respected her. She had never been entirely certain that Margaret respected her back. The invitation arrived 4 days after the dinner. Not a card, a letter, handwritten, in Margaret's angular script that looked like it had been taught by someone who believed penmanship was a moral virtue. Dear Elizabeth, come Tuesday, 11 o'clock, come alone. That was all. Elizabeth read it twice. Then she put it in her desk drawer beneath the notebook and told no one. Margaret's drawing room was exactly as Elizabeth remembered it, crowded with furniture that had been expensive a very long time ago and had since become something better than expensive. A fire burned despite the mildness of the day. 2 dogs of indeterminate breed occupied the best chairs with the confidence of animals who had never been told otherwise. Margaret was standing at the window when Elizabeth was shown in. She turned, looked her over in the thorough, unhurried way she looked at everything, and gestured to a chair that did not contain a dog. "Sit down, you look well. I expected you to look worse." "Thank you," said Elizabeth and sat. That was not entirely a compliment. Margaret settled into her own chair. "Tea." "Please." A maid appeared, poured, and disappeared. Margaret watched Elizabeth lift her cup and said, without preamble, "I heard about the dinner." I assumed you would. The Countess of Wexham tells me everything within 48 hours. It's one of the great reliabilities of my life." She paused. "She said your hands didn't shake." "No," said Elizabeth, "they didn't." Margaret studied her for a long moment. One of the dogs shifted in its chair and sighed heavily, as though it too was forming an assessment. "I don't like her," Margaret said finally. "Lady Harlow. Is there another woman currently making a spectacle of herself in my family's dining room?" She set down her cup with a precise click. "I didn't like her the first time James brought her round 12 years ago. I told him so then. He didn't listen. James has never listened to me about women, which is his single greatest failing and the one I find most inexplicable, given that I am myself a woman and have therefore been considerably more right about them than he has." Elizabeth said nothing. She was learning very quickly that silences in Margaret's company were not empty, they were tests. "You're not going to ask me what happened 12 years ago," Margaret observed. "I assumed you'd tell me when you chose to." Something shifted in the old woman's eyes, infinitesimally, but it shifted. "Good," she said, "that's good." She told her over the second cup of tea. 12 years ago, Vivienne Harlow, then Vivienne Castley, before her brief and strategically useful marriage to the late Lord Harlow, had attached herself to James during his third season. James had been 28, recently inherited the dukedom, and possessed of the particular vulnerability of a man who has suddenly become very important and is not yet entirely sure he deserves it. Vivienne had been 25 and had already understood, with crystalline precision, exactly what she wanted and exactly how to want it in a way that men found irresistible. It had lasted 8 months. It had ended, Margaret said, because she herself had ended it, through means she did not specify, in a tone that made clear she did not intend to. She married Harlow 6 weeks later, Margaret said. He was 63 and unwell and dead within the year, which surprised no one. She got the title and a modest income and apparently decided, at some point in the intervening decade, that modest was no longer sufficient. Elizabeth processed this. "And James, does he know you were involved in ending it?" "James knows what I allow him to know." A pause. "He is my son and I love him. He is also, in certain respects, a fool. These things are not mutually exclusive." Elizabeth looked at her hands. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Outside, a carriage passed. One of the dogs opened one eye, decided the situation required no action and closed it again. "Because," Margaret said, "you are the Duchess of Ashford, and because what is being done to you in that house is an embarrassment to this family that I will not tolerate." She paused. "And because you didn't break. At that dinner, you didn't break, and I wanted to see if you understood why that mattered." "I think I do," said Elizabeth quietly. "Good." Margaret reached forward and refilled Elizabeth's cup without being asked. "Then I'm going to tell you something else. Something about this family that James has apparently forgotten." She set the teapot down. "The Ashford family records everything," she said. "Every transaction, every debt, every arrangement that has ever been made on behalf of this house, going back 140 years. She met Elizabeth's eyes. Everything. The fire crackled. Elizabeth did not look away. "The ledgers," she said carefully, "are kept where?" The corner of Margaret's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was something more considered than a smile. "The library," she said, "third shelf from the left, behind the Debrets." Elizabeth left Mayfair at 12:30. She walked rather than taking the carriage, despite the cold, because she needed the air and the movement and the particular clarity that came from putting one foot in front of the other on a London pavement, while her mind worked very quickly and very quietly. Margaret had not told her what to do. She had not offered a plan or a strategy or a next step. She had simply opened a door and stepped back and allowed Elizabeth to decide whether to walk through it. Elizabeth had decided. She was home by 1. She went directly to the library, third shelf from the left, behind the Debrits. The ledgers were exactly where Margaret had said they would be. She took the most recent 3 to her sitting room, locked the door and began to read. Elizabeth was not, by nature, a dramatic woman. She did not gasp. She did not press her hand to her mouth. She did not feel the room tilt or the candle flicker in any way that felt symbolic. She simply sat at her writing desk in the gray afternoon light, turned the pages of the Ashford household ledger with careful hands, and read. And read. And read. It took her 2 hours to find the first entry. It took her another 40 minutes to understand what she was looking at. And it took her, after that, precisely no time at all to understand what it meant. The payments had begun 14 months ago. Which was, she noted, the same month James had come home from his club in unusually high spirits. They were not labeled with Vivienne's name. James was not that careless. They were recorded under a series of innocuous headings: property maintenance, legal consultation, estate miscellaneous, small enough individually to pass without question, significant enough, accumulated over 14 months, to constitute a number that made Elizabeth sit very still in her chair for a long moment. £4,200. She did her arithmetic twice. The number did not change. £4,200 drawn from the Ashford household accounts, accounts that were funded in no small part by the income from her own dowry settlement, her father's money, the Earl of Pembridge's careful, unglamorous, thoroughly documented contribution to this marriage, being paid in monthly installments to Vivienne Harlow. Elizabeth set the ledger down. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the garden for approximately 30 seconds, then walked back and sat down and picked up the ledger again. She was not finished. The second discovery took longer because she was not looking for it. She had moved to the oldest of the 3 ledgers, more out of thoroughness than expectation, and was working her way through entries from 8 years prior when a name caught her eye. Not Vivienne's name, another name entirely. Lord C. Beaumont. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name, in the way one knows the names of things that have been carefully buried, because the burial itself becomes a kind of knowledge. Lord Christopher Beaumont had been a minor scandal 6 or 7 years ago. Something murky, something that had lasted approximately 1 season in the public conversation, before disappearing with the particular efficiency of stories that powerful people prefer not to tell. She had never known the details. She had not thought to wonder. She wondered now. The entry was brief. A payment substantial, a single lump sum rather than installments, recorded under asterisk legal settlement, private matter, and cross-referenced with a solicitor's name she did not recognize. The date was 10 years ago, before James had married her. Before, she calculated quickly, Vivienne had married Lord Harlow. She stared at the entry for a long time. Then she went to James's study. He was at his club. She knew his schedule with the precision of a woman who had learned to track such things, and found, in the lower drawer of his desk, the correspondence files she had known were there and never previously had reason to open. It took her 20 minutes to find the solicitor's letter. It took her 5 minutes to read it. She sat in her husband's chair in her husband's study with the letter in her hands, and understood, with complete and terrible clarity, exactly what Vivienne Harlow was. Lord Beaumont had not been Vivienne's victim. He had been her previous attempt. 10 years ago, Vivienne Castley, not yet Lady Harlow, not yet anyone's widow, had attached herself to Lord Beaumont in precisely the manner she had since attached herself to James. The attachment had progressed. Certain promises had apparently been made or implied, or constructed with sufficient artfulness that they could be argued either way depending on who was doing the arguing. When Beaumont had attempted to end the arrangement, Vivienne had produced letters, or something very like letters, documents that suggested an intimacy that would, if made public, ruin him, and more critically, ruin his recently married daughter, who had done nothing whatsoever to deserve it. Beaumont had paid, handsomely, quietly, and with the particular thoroughness of a man who wanted the matter to disappear so completely that even its shadow would not remain. The solicitor's letter, addressed to James, 8 years ago, was a warning. A colleague of Beaumont's, a man who knew James slightly and felt he ought to know, passing along the information in the careful, deniable language of gentlemen who cannot quite bring themselves to say plainly what they mean. James had kept the letter, which meant James had known. Elizabeth read the letter a second time, then a third. Then she folded it with great care along its original creases, returned it to its envelope, replaced it in the correspondence file, closed the drawer, and stood up. She walked to the window. The garden was darkening. Somewhere in the house a clock struck 5. James had known who Vivienne was, what she was. He had kept a letter documenting it and filed it neatly away and then, 8 years later, invited her into this house anyway. Elizabeth stood at the window for a long time. She was not angry, or rather, she was angry profoundly in a way that had weight and temperature and a very specific shape. But the anger was not the loudest thing she felt. The loudest thing was something colder and more useful. Clarity. She knew now. She knew what Vivienne was, what she wanted, what she had done before, and what she was positioned to do again. She knew about the payments. She knew about Beaumont. She knew about the letter. And Vivienne did not know that she knew. That asymmetry was, Elizabeth understood, the only advantage that mattered. She did not intend to waste it. She returned the ledgers to the library that evening, third shelf from the left, behind the Debrets, precisely as she had found them. Then she went to her sitting room, opened her notebook, and turned to Vivienne Harlowe's page. She did not write anything immediately. She sat for a while in the firelight, thinking with the particular stillness that looked, from the outside, like a woman doing nothing at all. Then she wrote, in her neat, unhurried hand. Beaumont, the letters, the payments, he knew. She looked at it for a moment. Then beneath it, she wrote one more line. Wait, not yet, the right moment. She closed the notebook. She would wait. She was good at waiting. She had been practicing without knowing it for years. But she was not, she had decided, going to wait forever. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in February. Elizabeth was at breakfast when James brought it in, which was itself unusual enough to make her set down her cup. James did not typically attend breakfast. James attended breakfast approximately 4 times a year, on occasions that invariably preceded something she was not going to enjoy. He sat down. He did not pour himself tea. He placed the letter on the table between them, in the careful way one places something one has already decided to do and is now simply performing the courtesy of appearing to discuss. I've had an offer, he said, for Wren Cottage. Elizabeth looked at the letter. She did not touch it. An offer, she repeated. A very reasonable one. The property has been underutilized for some time. It costs more to maintain than it returns, and frankly the funds could be better directed toward. Toward what, James? He paused. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, but its thinner, more evasive cousin. Toward the estate, he said, various improvements. The fire crackled. A footman stood motionless near the sideboard, examining the middle distance with the practiced blankness of a man who had learned that the less he appeared to hear, the more comfortable everyone's mornings remained. Elizabeth looked at her husband. She thought about the ledger. £4,200, various improvements. Wren Cottage, she said, was part of my dowry settlement. It was transferred to the estate upon our marriage. Legally it is. I know what it is legally, James. A silence. It's a small property, he said, with the gentleness of a man who believes that tone can substitute for substance. You've hardly been there in 2 years. This was true. She had not been to Wren Cottage in 2 years because 2 years ago James had begun scheduling obligations on every weekend she had previously reserved for it, and she had accommodated those obligations because she had been, at that point, still operating under the assumption that accommodation was a form of investment, that if she gave enough, adjusted enough, made herself small enough in the places that seemed to matter to him, something would eventually return to her in kind. She understood now, with the clarity that had been building in her since the ledger, since the letter, since the dinner, since the garden, since that first Friday afternoon when Vivienne Harlow had stepped out of a carriage in red and looked at this house like she was already measuring the curtains. She understood that accommodation had not been an investment. It had simply been a loss. When, she said, is the sale to be completed? End of the month. 23 days. She nodded once. She picked up her cup. She finished her tea. Thank you for telling me, she said. He left the room. The footman continued to examine the middle distance. Elizabeth sat for a moment longer, then folded her napkin, placed it beside her plate, and went upstairs. She did not go to her sitting room. She went instead to her bedroom, her own bedroom, which she had occupied alone for the past 8 months, since James had taken to sleeping in the east wing without explanation, and she had taken to not requiring one. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and looked at the wall. Wren Cottage. She had loved it from the first moment she had seen it, in the early weeks of her marriage when James had still been making the effort that men make in early weeks, before the effort reveals itself to be finite. It was not grand. It was not impressive. It was a low stone house with deep windowsills and a garden that had clearly once been beautiful and was currently in an advanced state of optimistic disorder. And the moment she had walked through its door she had felt, for the first and, as it turned out, only time in her marriage, that she was somewhere she actually belonged. She had planted roses in that garden, her own hands. She had spent 3 consecutive weekends one summer doing nothing but reading in the window seat of the upstairs bedroom, watching the light change over the hills. She had kept a second notebook there, not the one with Vivienne's name in it, a different one, a softer one, full of nothing more significant than observations about the weather and what she had read and what she had thought about it. That was all it was. A cottage, a garden, a window seat, a place where she was simply Elizabeth, not the Duchess of Ashford, not the second daughter of the Earl of Pembridge, not a contract or a function or a very efficient solution to a seating arrangement. And he was going to sell it. Not because the estate needed the money. She knew, from the ledger, exactly where the estate's money was going. He was going to sell it because Vivienne had asked him to, or because selling it served some purpose she had not yet identified, or simply because it was Elizabeth's, and he had, at some point without announcement, stopped seeing any reason to protect what was hers. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Then something happened that had not happened in a very long time. Not since the garden, not since the dining room, not since the morning she had opened the ledger and found £4,200 disappearing into a woman's ivory-gloved hands. She felt, moving through her, slow and enormous and long overdue, something that was not grief and not fear, and not the careful, managed anger she had been keeping at a precise and useful temperature for months. It was rage. Clean, quiet, absolute. She did not act on it that day, nor the next. She waited 4 days, which was, she had calculated, the exact amount of time required for James to believe the matter was settled and move his attention elsewhere. Then, on a Monday evening while James was at his club and the house was quiet, she sat at her writing desk, took out a single sheet of paper and wrote a letter. It was not a long letter. It did not need to be. The most precise instruments are rarely large. She addressed it, sealed it, and held it in her hands for a moment. It was not addressed to Vivienne. It was not addressed to James. It was not addressed to a solicitor or a magistrate or any of the obvious recipients one might imagine for a letter written by a woman in her position, at her limit, with everything she knew. It was addressed to a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Alcott, wife of Sir Frederick, who had been at the dinner, who moved in every circle that mattered, who had known Vivienne Harlow in a previous life in a way that Elizabeth had discovered, through careful and patient inquiry, had not ended pleasantly. The letter contained 3 things: a question of fact and an invitation to tea. Elizabeth rang for her maid. "See that this is delivered tomorrow morning," she said, "first thing." "Yes, Your Grace." She watched the letter leave her hand. Then she opened her notebook, turned to Vivienne Harlow's page, and drew a single, clean line beneath everything she had written there. Below the line she wrote 4 words. The right moment, now. The thing about London society, Elizabeth had long understood, was that it did not punish scandal. It punished *boring scandal. A man keeping a mistress was not interesting. A man keeping a mistress while his wife quietly deteriorated was not interesting. These were stories as old as the city itself, worn smooth by repetition, no longer capable of producing more than a mild, collective sigh over the soup course. But a woman with a history, a woman who had done it before, to another family, in another drawing room, with the same hands and the same smile and the same careful architecture of destruction, that was interesting. That was the kind of story that London society picked up and turned over and examined from every angle with the focused attention of people who have been given something genuinely new to look at. Elizabeth had understood this when she wrote the letter. She had understood it when she chose Dorothea Alcott. And she understood it now, sitting in Dorothea's pale yellow morning room on a Wednesday, watching the older woman read the single page she had handed her with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who grasps, very quickly, that what they are holding is not merely a piece of paper. Dorothea Alcott was 53, silver-haired and possessed of a social network so vast and so meticulously maintained that Elizabeth had once heard the Countess of Wexham describe her, with genuine admiration, as the exchange upon which London's real currency is traded. She had known Vivienne 12 years ago, had, in fact, introduced her to certain circles, under the impression that Vivienne was something she had subsequently discovered she was not. That discovery had cost Dorothea nothing material, but it had cost her something she valued considerably more than money: her judgment. Dorothea Alcott did not forgive errors in judgment, especially her own. She finished reading. She set the page down on her knee. She looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was not quite surprise. It was more the expression of a woman who has been handed confirmation of something she has suspected for a very long time. "The Beaumont matter," she said. "You knew." "I knew something, not the shape of it." She tapped the letter once with one finger. "Where did you find this?" "I read carefully," said Elizabeth. Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Your husband knew about Beaumont." "Yes." "And invited her anyway." "Yes." A pause. Something moved through Dorothea's expression, not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it, something with more steel in it than sympathy. "What is it you want, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap. "I want the truth to be known," she said, By the right people, in the right way, she paused. I want it to happen without my name attached to it. That asterisk, said Dorothea, is a very precise want. I am a very precise person. Dorothea looked at her for another long moment. Then she picked up the letter again, read one section a second time and set it down. Give me a week, she said. It took 5 days. Elizabeth knew it had begun on the second day, because James came home from his club with a particular quality of silence that she recognized. Not his usual silence, which was absent and distracted, but a new silence, tightly wound, aware of itself. She said nothing. She poured his tea. She asked pleasantly whether he had enjoyed his afternoon. He said yes. He drank his tea. He left the room. On the third day she heard, through the ordinary channels of household intelligence that she had spent 4 years quietly cultivating, a word to her lady's maid, a question to the housekeeper, the careful attention one pays to the information that moves through a house like water through walls, that Vivienne Harlow had cancelled 2 engagements. On the 4th day, the Countess of Wexham called unexpectedly at Ashford House and was received by Elizabeth in the front drawing-room, where the 2 women had a conversation that was, on the surface, entirely about the upcoming spring charitable exhibition. Beneath the surface it was about something else entirely. The Countess left after 40 minutes, kissed Elizabeth on both cheeks, which she had never previously done, and said, "You are looking remarkably well, my dear." "Thank you," said Elizabeth. "I am feeling remarkably well." She meant it, she realized as she said it. On the 5th day James came to her sitting room. He did not knock. He did not need to. It was his house, technically, legally, in all the ways that currently mattered and several that soon would not. He came in and stood in the middle of the room with the particular posture of a man who has arrived somewhere, without being entirely certain how to proceed now that he is there. Elizabeth was reading. She finished her paragraph before she looked up. James. He was quiet for a moment. He looked, she thought, older than he had looked in October. Not in a way that produced sympathy particularly, but in a way she noticed. "There are things being said," he began. "Are there?" "About Lady Harlow, about certain matters from years ago." "I see." "I don't know how," he stopped, started again. "It's causing difficulties." "I imagine it is." He looked at her, really looked at her, in the way he had perhaps looked at her when she was managing that difficult seating arrangement at a dinner years ago, before he had decided that looking at her was no longer necessary. There was something in his expression she had not seen before. Not remorse exactly. Not yet. But the precursor to remorse, the dawning, uncomfortable awareness that one has made a series of decisions whose consequences are now arranged in a row, waiting to be accounted for. "Elizabeth," he said, "I know what you need, James," she said. She set her book down. Her voice was entirely calm. "Sit down." He sat. And for the first time in 4 years of marriage, Elizabeth Ashford spoke first. She did not rage. She did not weep. She did not produce the notebook or reference the ledger or name the sum of £4,200, though she felt each of those things present in the room with her like quiet witnesses. She spoke for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on the mantelpiece, not because she was timing herself, but because precision had always been her comfort and she found it comforting now. She told him what she knew. Not everything, she was precise, not exhaustive. She told him enough. She told him about Beaumont. She told him about the letter she had found in his own desk. She told him, quietly and without drama, that she was aware of where the household funds had been directed for the past 14 months. She told him about Wren Cottage. At this last one something crossed his face that was, finally, unmistakably the thing itself, not its precursor, remorse. She did not pause for it. "I am not," she said, "asking you to perform contrition, James. I am not asking for declarations or explanations or apologies, though you owe me all three. What I am asking for is very simple." She had thought about this moment for weeks. She had drafted it, revised it, discarded versions that were too soft and versions that were too hard, until she had found the one that was simply, precisely true. "I am asking for my chair back," she said. "My name, my household, my cottage," she paused, "and your actual respect, not the performance of it, the thing itself." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the street, a carriage passed. The fire settled. The clock continued its steady, indifferent count. "And if I can't," he said very quietly, "give you those things." Elizabeth looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had poured tea for 26 people, without her hands trembling, and slept, afterward, without difficulty. "Then I will," she said simply, "no longer need them from you." Vivian Harlow left London on a Saturday. Elizabeth knew because the Countess of Wexham told her, with the satisfied precision of a woman delivering exactly the information she has been entrusted to deliver, at a Tuesday afternoon call she had not previously scheduled. "Retreating to the country," the Countess said, accepting her tea. "Indefinitely, one hears." "How unfortunate," said Elizabeth. "Isn't it?" said the Countess, and smiled into her cup. James came to her sitting room that evening. He knocked this time. "Come in," she said. He stood in the doorway. He had something in his hand, a document, folded. He crossed the room and placed it on the writing desk beside her. She looked at it without touching it. "The sale of Wren Cottage," he said, "has been cancelled." She nodded once. He did not leave immediately. He stood for a moment in the way of a man who has something further to say and has not yet located the language for it. "I knew," he said finally, "about Beaumont. I knew what she was." "Yes," said Elizabeth, "I know you did." "I thought," he stopped. "I don't know what I thought." She said nothing. She had learned over the years that some silences were kinder than words, and some were simply more accurate. "Elizabeth," he said, I think I would like to try." She looked at him. At this man she had married at 22 with clear eyes and realistic expectations, who had failed her in ways both careless and deliberate, who had looked through her for 4 years as though she were a very competent piece of furniture, and who was standing in front of her now with something in his face that was not a performance. She did not answer immediately. She thought about the chair at the head of the table, about the tea poured steady-handed for 26 people, about the cottage and the roses she had planted there with her own hands, and the window seat, and the notebook full of quiet things. About what it meant to try, and what it would cost, and whether she believed him. She was not certain yet. But she was, she discovered, willing to find out. "Then we will try," she said. The invitations went out in April. On Ashford House stationery, in Elizabeth's own hand. 28 guests this time, 2 more than the winter dinner, which was noted by exactly the people who notice such things, and interpreted correctly by all of them. The Countess of Wexham accepted within the hour. Dorothea Alcott accepted by return post with a handwritten addition at the bottom of her reply card that said simply, "I wouldn't miss it." Even Margaret, who declined most invitations on principle, and had not attended a dinner at Ashford House in 3 years, sent word that she would come. Elizabeth read each acceptance as it arrived. She added each name to her list in her neat, unhurried hand. She did not remark upon any of them to James, and James did not ask, which was, she was finding, carefully and without rushing the finding, beginning to be less characteristic of him than it once had been. He had been trying, she had been watching. It was early days. She was not a woman given to premature conclusions. The preparations took 3 weeks. She approached them the way she approached everything, methodically, thoroughly, with attention to the details that other people considered beneath attention, and that Elizabeth had always understood to be precisely where the substance of things lived. The flowers she selected herself, from a florist on Bond Street who had been supplying Ashford House for a decade and knew, without being told, that the Duchess had opinions. The menu she composed with the cook over 2 long mornings at the kitchen table, tasting and adjusting and tasting again until it was exactly right. The seating arrangement she drew up once, a single version, clean and certain, without revision. Her name at the head of the table. She looked at it for a moment after she wrote it. Then she handed it to the butler without comment and went upstairs to dress. The guests arrived at 8. She received them in the entrance hall, not the drawing room, the entrance hall, which was a choice and was understood as one. She wore deep blue silk that she had commissioned in January and not worn yet, because January had not been the right moment and she had known then that the right moment was coming. She was, everyone agreed afterward, remarkable. Not in the way she had always been remarkable, efficiently, competently in the background, making everything function so smoothly that her contribution was invisible precisely because it was indispensable. This was different. This was the kind of remarkable that takes up space, that does not apologize for itself. The Countess of Wexham, arriving on the arm of her husband, took both of Elizabeth's hands at the door and held them for a moment and said nothing at all, which from the Countess was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Margaret arrived last, as she always did, because she had been arriving last to events for 50 years and saw no reason to reform. She was wearing something other than gray, a deep charcoal that was, for Margaret, practically festive. She looked at Elizabeth in the entrance hall for a long moment with those sharp, assessing eyes. Then she said, "Good," and walked in. Dinner was announced at 9. The guests moved through in the prescribed order, finding their places, settling, the familiar small rustlings and murmurs of a formal gathering assembling itself. The candles were lit. The good silver caught the light, the same silver as winter, the Ashford pieces, the ones that came out only for occasions that warranted them. Elizabeth was the last to be seated. She walked the length of the dining room without hurry, past the parliamentary members and the bishop and Dorothea Alcott, who looked up as she passed and gave her the smallest, most precise nod, past Margaret, who did not look up but whose stillness conveyed everything, past James, who stood at his place at the foot of the table and watched her with an expression she had not seen on his face before and was not yet certain how to name. She reached the head of the table. She sat down. For a moment, just a moment, the room was absolutely silent. It was a different silence from the winter dinner. That silence had been shocked, suspended, the silence of people watching something they couldn't quite interpret. This silence was something else. It had weight to it, recognition, the particular held-breath quality of a room full of people who understand that they are witnessing something they will describe later to people who weren't there. Then Margaret lifted her wine glass. She did not say anything. She simply lifted it, in Elizabeth's direction, with the deliberate precision of a woman making a statement she has been composing for some time. Around the table, one by one, the glasses rose. James's was the last. He lifted it slowly. He looked at his wife across the long, candle-lit distance of the Ashford dining table, past the silver, past the flowers, past 26 years of family history and 4 years of their own, and he held her gaze with an expression that was, Elizabeth decided, the one she had not been able to name. It was, she thought, the beginning of respect. Not the performance of it, the thing itself. She inclined her head, very slightly. Then she turned to the guest on her left and began, with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own chair, to speak. The dinner lasted 4 hours. It was, by any measure that London society applied to such things, a triumph. The food was exceptional. The conversation was brilliant. The flowers were perfect. And the Duchess of Ashford was, everyone agreed, in the carriage's home, and the drawing rooms the following morning, and the letters exchanged across the following week. Utterly, completely, magnificently herself. The Countess of Wexham was heard to say, at no fewer than 3 separate engagements in the days following, that it was the finest dinner she had attended in a decade. She did not mention Vivienne Harlow's name once. Nobody did. It was past midnight when the last carriage rolled away, and the house settled into quiet. The staff moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, clearing and extinguishing and restoring. Elizabeth stood in the entrance hall in her blue silk and watched them work with the satisfactions of a woman whose plans have arrived, at last, exactly where she intended them to. James appeared beside her. He had been directing the footmen in the cloakroom and looked, she thought, more at ease than he had in months. The wound-tight quality that had lived in him since February had loosened. Not gone, she was not naive about the distance still between them, the accounting that still remained to be done, but loosened. It was a remarkable evening, he said. Yes, she agreed, it was. A pause. Around them the house worked in breath. The seating arrangement, he said, it was correct. She looked at him. It was, she said simply. He nodded. He seemed to want to say something further and to be finding, as he often did, that the language for it was not immediately available to him. She watched him search for it with a patience that was, she realized, genuinely patient now rather than strategic, a patience that came from something other than calculation. I would like, he said finally, to see Wren Cottage. If you, I thought perhaps in the spring. Yes, she said, I'd like that. He looked at her for a moment, then he offered his arm. She took it. They walked together through the quiet house, past the portraits of the previous dukes and duchesses of Ashford looking down from the walls with their painted, inscrutable faces, through the hall and up the stairs, and the house was still and warm around them, and for the first time in a very long time it felt, simply, like home. 2 years later, the roses at Wren Cottage were exceptional that summer. Elizabeth had replanted the east bed in April, on her knees in the good Devon soil with her gardening gloves and her second notebook beside her on the grass, the soft one, the one full of weather observations and reading notes and quiet thoughts, and by July the results were, she felt, everything she had intended. She was sitting in the window seat of the upstairs bedroom on a Saturday afternoon when she heard the carriage on the gravel below. She did not move immediately. She finished the paragraph she was reading, marked her page, and looked out the window at the garden with the unhurried attention of a woman who has learned, properly this time and not as strategy, to take her time. James came through the gate carrying what appeared to be a very large and structurally ambiguous arrangement of wildflowers, which he had clearly gathered himself from the fields on the far side of the property, and which suggested a sincerity of effort that more than compensated for its lack of formal elegance. She watched him look up at the window. She raised her hand. He raised the flowers. She laughed, really laughed, the way she had perhaps laughed before she had known him. In some version of herself she had thought was gone for good and had discovered, with considerable surprise, was merely waiting. They had not had an easy 2 years. She would not have described them that way and would not have wanted to. Easy was not the right word for the slow, sometimes painful work of two people deciding to actually see each other after years of looking past each other in opposite directions. There had been difficult conversations, real ones, not the performance of conversation. There had been evenings that did not go well. There had been a week in November, 7 months after the April dinner, when she had seriously and soberly considered whether she had made the right decision, and had sat alone at Wren Cottage for 4 days thinking about it with the full weight of her attention. She had decided, at the end of those 4 days, that she had. Not because everything was resolved. Not because the ledger was balanced. Some debts, she had understood, were not the kind that could be settled in full, only acknowledged and carried differently. But because the man who had come to collect her at the end of those 4 days had driven himself, without the carriage, in the rain, and had stood at the door of the cottage with wet shoulders and said, without preamble or performance, "I should have come sooner. I'm sorry." That was the thing itself, not the performance. She had let him in. Margaret came to Wren Cottage in June. This was unprecedented. Margaret did not, as a rule, leave Mayfair between April and September, having long ago decided that the countryside was charming in theory and unreliable in practice. But she appeared one Tuesday afternoon in a carriage that looked slightly pained by the Devon roads, dressed in her usual deliberate gray, carrying a walking stick she did not appear to need, and a small package wrapped in brown paper that she placed on the kitchen table without explanation. Elizabeth made tea. Margaret sat in the good chair by the window and looked at the garden and said, with the satisfaction of a woman whose assessments have been vindicated, "The east bed is coming in well." "Yes," said Elizabeth, "it is." They drank their tea. Outside, somewhere in the fields, James could be heard having a disagreement with a gate that had been sticking since March and that Elizabeth had asked him twice to have repaired. The sound suggested he had decided to resolve the matter personally. They also suggested he was losing. Margaret listened to this for a moment. The corner of her mouth moved. "He was always better with people than with gates," she said. "He's improving," said Elizabeth, "with both." Margaret looked at her with those sharp, assessing eyes. Something in them was, if not soft, Margaret did not do soft, then at least less armored than usual. The look of a woman who has reached the end of a long project and found the result, on balance, acceptable. "Open the package," she said. Elizabeth unwrapped it. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook. Old clearly, the leather worn soft with age, the pages thick and cream-colored and entirely blank. She looked at it for a moment. "It was mine," Margaret said. "When I was young, I never used it. I was always too busy deciding things to write them down." A pause. "I thought you might have a better use for it." Elizabeth ran her thumb along the edge of the pages. "Thank you, Margaret." "Don't thank me." The old woman picked up her cup. "Use it." Outside, the gate apparently conceded. Footsteps on the garden path. The sound of the kitchen door. James appeared, slightly disheveled, with the expression of a man who has won an argument with an inanimate object and feels this reflects well on him. He looked at Margaret. "Mother, I didn't know you were coming." "I know," said Margaret. "That was the point." She looked at him over her teacup with the loving, exasperated precision of a woman who has been assessing the same person for 43 years. "You have mud on your jacket." "The gate has been sticking since March," said Elizabeth. "I mentioned it." "Twice," said Margaret. James looked between them. Something crossed his face. A flicker of the particular expression of a man who understands that he is, at this moment, and possibly in general, somewhat outmatched. Then he laughed. And Elizabeth laughed, and after a moment, with the grace of a woman who had decided long ago that dignity and laughter were not mutually exclusive, Margaret laughed too, in the kitchen of Wren Cottage on a June afternoon with the roses coming in on the east bed, and the tea going cold and the gate finally, thoroughly fixed. It was later, after Margaret had gone and James had fallen asleep in the garden chair in the early evening sun with a book open on his chest, that Elizabeth sat in the window seat and opened the new notebook. She held her pen for a moment, looking out at the garden, at the roses, at her husband sleeping in the gold light with his mouth slightly open and his book sliding slowly toward the grass, and his face, in sleep, entirely unguarded, the face, she thought, of the man he actually was, underneath everything he had performed and everything he had failed at and everything he was still, quietly, working to become. She thought about the other notebook, Vivienne Harlow's page, the 4 words she had written the night she decided. The right moment now. It had been the right moment. And it had worked. Not because she had been ruthless, she had not been ruthless. Not because she had destroyed anyone, she had not destroyed anyone, not even Vivienne, who had retreated to the country and would, Elizabeth suspected, resurface eventually in some other drawing room, attaching herself to some other household. That was Vivienne's nature, and Elizabeth had long since stopped expecting nature to reform itself simply because it was inconvenient. It had worked because she had been, with absolute consistency, precisely herself. That was all. That was the whole of it. She looked down at the blank page of Margaret's notebook. She wrote the date, then beneath it one line. The East Bed is exceptional this year. She looked at it for a moment. Then she smiled, the real one, the one that had nothing to do with drawing rooms or dinner tables or the precise management of difficult situations, and turned the page. She had, she thought, a great deal more to write. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.